Hello English 1102 students, welcome to this video lecture on Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance because when you think of Langston Hughes you have to think of the Harlem Renaissance, or if you think of the Harlem Renaissance, probably the most important poet of all of that would be Langston Hughes. So what I want you to do is while you're watching this video to go into your class page, and I don't know how I've got it for the particular class you're in. Sometimes I have each poet has his or her own slideshow, or if you're in, like, say, a summer term or an A or B term, I could have all the poetry in one long slideshow in the poetry folder. So find either the poetry slideshow or the Langston Hughes slideshow and follow along with me on that as I speak about it. And I'll pause for a minute while you open that up. Okay, so I'm hoping that you have the slideshow open. So Langston Hughes, born in 1902 in Missouri, died in 1967 in New York City. He is an interesting fella. He actually, even though he identified mostly with his, his African American roots or his black roots or whatever you want to call them, he did have a father who was half white, half black. So there's a little bit of a mixture there, but really he did not identify with the white part of his family nearly as much as he did the black part. So he's a very important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. So what I'm going to do is go to the next slide here, and of course I don't have what I'm looking for. But basically the Harlem Renaissance is important for this reason. The Harlem Renaissance was an arts movement, and it was designed in such a way that African Americans and whites would get equal social status through the arts. So in other words, the black artists, whether they were poets or whether they were musicians or whether they were painters or playwrights or whatever, would get their art out there, and then as a result, the white establishment would incorporate their art into the white art world and therefore bring about equality for whites and blacks. Now, the black art did have some success in getting incorporated. That part was not exactly a failure, but the equality that was supposed to come from it obviously didn't work out. The Harlem Renaissance occurred in the 1920s, and if you remember your history from the 60s and all the civil rights violence and things going on with that, then you know that incorporating music and plays and poetry into mainstream America did not necessarily equate to racial equality. But it did have some lasting impact. If you want to think about some of the Harlem Renaissance's most important people, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an intellectual, comes to mind. George Washington Carver, even though he was an old man by the time the Harlem Renaissance occurred, he was a figure in it. Singers, you've got Louis Armstrong, and there's Bessie Smith and Lena Horne, among others, Dizzy Gillespie, among others, that had some success in incorporating their music into the mainstream. And if you had to read Sonny's Blues for this class, you'll remember that Sonny's brother, or actually no, Sonny himself, thought that some of the black artists from Harlem that actually incorporated their music into the white culture were sellouts, and he did not like them for that reason. But be that as it may, that's there was some success with that. And then you get to Langston Hughes, and Langston Hughes is probably the most important poet of them all. And he also wrote a couple of plays, particularly Mulatto, which was important. So narrowing it down to a couple of poems for Langston Hughes was a tough choice because he wrote so many good ones. But I've chosen two that I think are going to really show his voice. So the first poem, according to the slideshow, is Harlem, and you'll see it was published in 1951. If you're using this particular textbook, it's on page 172. If you're using a different textbook, because I've changed textbooks for some reason, then it's probably written in your syllabus or your schedule what page to find Harlem on. So if you want to open to that for a minute, I'll pause while you do that. Okay, so if you're on Harlem, you'll notice it's a very, very short poem. You'll also notice that Harlem itself is never mentioned. So if you go to the next slideshow, that's the first line there. It's never mentioned at all. But the first line connects very intimately with Harlem when it says, "What happens to a dream deferred?" All right. First of all, we have to define what deferred means. Deferred does not mean canceled. It's not the same thing. Deferred means put off until later, or not quite fulfilled yet. So, what dream are we talking about? Well, if the title of the poem is Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance occurred in the 1920s. By the time we get to 1951, there is still not the kind of equality that the Harlem Renaissance had hoped to bring about. Then perhaps the dream deferred is the dream of equality that the Harlem Renaissance was supposed to bring about. So, because of that, this poem is really about the unfulfilled promise of the Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance. So, what happens to a dream deferred? Now, instead of trying to answer the question, what our narrator does is ask another series of questions, which is highly unusual. Usually when a poet poses a question, that poet then tries to answer the question. But not in this case. In this case, the poet just raises more questions. And so the first one is, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Now, raisins are dried out grapes anyway, right? But if they continue to dry out and continue to dry out and continue to dry out, they become inedible at some point, and you can't really eat them. They become hard. So the sun, the light that shined on this raisin, keeps sapping its usefulness and keeps sapping it while it's in that sunlight in order to make it not so useful anymore. So at some point the raisin just becomes, something that has to be thrown away. Or fester like a sore and then run. So festering. This is possibly what has happened with this dream deferred. Over the previous couple of decades, this unfulfilled dream has festered and gotten worse. Just like if you have a sore and you don't put ointment on it and don't cover it with a Band-Aid, eventually you might get an infection and it will actually be worse. In fact, if the infection is bad enough, if it happens, say, like on an arm, that arm would have to be removed because you would get something called gangrene. So, festering like a sore and then running is really something that should have been taken care of, wasn't taken care of, and because of it, it has gotten worse. Just like the unfulfilled dream here, or the deferred dream in this case. Does it stink like rotten meat? Folks, I love a good steak as much as the next person. Give me a nice fresh steak, throw it on the grill for a couple of minutes on each side so it's nice and medium rare, juicy, it's delicious. Not only is a steak delicious in taste, but it also has nutritional benefits, particularly protein, which is used to make muscle. But now, take that same piece of steak and let it sit out for a while without being cooked or without being eaten. And you'll find that eventually it will start to go bad and it will start to rot. And when it does, it gives off this pungent odor. In fact, it smells to high heaven. The color changes from a nice, pinkish, reddish color to some kind of a brown, or it could turn green if it sits there long enough. And also, to try and consume that steak and eat it after it's gone rotten actually has negative health repercussions. It will make you sick rather than make you healthier. So here is the steak with the promise of protein and tasting great that has been left out to rot to a point where it not only smells bad and it not only tastes gross, but it also has negative health repercussions, and taking it in would actually be poisonous instead of nutritional. Maybe this is what's happened to the dream. Perhaps this dream has gotten so bad over the course of time and neglect that it has actually gotten worse and actually is toxic now instead of actually being beneficial. Are crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Who doesn't love a good Dunkin' Donut or a good Krispy Kreme donut? Those are nice. However, over time, that glaze will start to harden and it'll start to peel and fall off. And then the donut will turn stale. And eventually you don't want to eat it anymore. This unfulfilled dream, this deferred dream, if you will, has gotten stale. And it's not keeping the promise there. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Folks, if you take a glass, this bottle of water probably weighs less than a pound. And I hold it like this for a while, it seems like you can do it forever without any kind of negative repercussions. However, over time, that bottle will start getting heavier and heavier. And eventually, the muscles in my arm are going to start getting sore, and it's going to start hurting, and my arm will tremble because the weight of that light bottle has become heavier just by sitting there holding the bottle out like that. I also like to think perhaps of, say, if somebody's in the military and they've got their big backpack, their 50-pound backpack on their back. It seems heavy when you put 50 pounds on your pack to begin with, but as it continues to stay there, as you continue to march or continue to stand at attention or whatever it is you're doing, that weight will start to feel heavier, and it will start to sag, and it'll start to drag you backwards. So this unfulfilled dream has that negative repercussion as well. It's gone on so long that it's now become a heavy burden, and it's weighing an entire race down. And because of that, it is sagging. Or does it explode is the final question. Now, an explosion happens when there's so much tension built up that tension has to be released in some way. And this dream deferred was about to explode in the early 1950s. In fact, by the time we get to the late 50s and into the 60s, there are riots, and there is violence, and there's all kinds of chaos going on around this unfulfilled dream of the equality, of racial equality. And to a certain extent, that still goes on today in the year that you're watching this video. So, yes, does it explode? Does the tension build up so much that boom, and then you have all kinds of chaos and you have a great big mess? And that, I would say, is what the narrator of Harlem is predicting is going to happen. And of course, as we study history from a distance now, we see that it really did happen. So, that's Harlem. It's all about the dream of equality that the Harlem Renaissance is supposed to bring about, not being fulfilled yet. It's been deferred or put off, and it's causing all kinds of problems. Alright, so, that is Harlem. Now, I want to go backwards in this book to page 170, or go to whatever page it is in the book you're using. And you'll notice, if you're using this book, you'll notice that Negro Speaks of Rivers was dedicated to W.E.B. Du Bois. And, of course, he was an American historian, educator, and activist, and one of the founders of the NAACP. And the NAACP is still very active today. All right, so Negro Speaks of Rivers. The first question we have to ask as we read this is, who is the narrator? And if we get the opening line here, I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like rivers. All right. It helps to understand that civilization, or mankind as we know it, started off probably somewhere around modern day Iraq, and moved its way into Africa around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These rivers were necessary for drinking water, for disposal of waste, for as civilization started branching out, rivers were important for trade. I'll trade my corn for your cattle or whatever it was. Now, in early civilization, there was no such thing as corn. Mankind wouldn't find corn until Native Americans came over to North America. But the point is, rivers were crucial to the formation of civilization, and they were the civilization we know now that we live in today was rooted in these ancient civilizations that lived along the rivers. But these rivers are older than the flow of blood in human veins. Now, rivers move over the course of years, and some of them dry up and some of them start again and whatnot. But the fact is, some of these rivers are older than mankind. And his soul has grown deep like rivers. So some of the oldest rivers, like the Amazon, the Nile, the Mississippi, among other rivers, actually has grown deep over the years. And this narrator's soul has grown as deep as those rivers. In the next stanza, I bathed in the Euphrates, and that's just what I was talking about. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. Now, if a narrator were a human being, an individual that bathed in the Euphrates in the dawn when, what was it? When the dawns were young, that narrator would probably be about 100,000 years old. That is not true, right? Nobody has lived that long. So, Our narrator might not be an individual. Our narrator is probably the entire African race, or African American race, if you like. But really, even older than that, before those guys were brought over and those women were brought over as slaves, this narrator is that race that is still to this day rooted over in Africa. So, bathed in the Euphrates when the dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. The Congo is a very, very long river. It's the longest river in Africa. Very important river. In fact, wars have been fought over control of the Congo. And these wars have been fought over control of the Congo for tens of thousands of years. So, this narrator built huts, not houses, not mansions, not factories, huts, little one-room huts by the Congo. And the sound of the river was so peaceful that it lulled the people to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. Pyramids were essentially built, although some people will dispute this now. It was believed for many years that the pyramids were built by slaves that the Egyptians captured and put to work on them. Now people are making the argument, no, there were actually contractors and people that got paid to build these pyramids, just like people get paid to build houses now. But whichever side you agree on, whether it was slave labor or whether it was paid labor, it was still Africans that actually built the pyramids. Many of them came from places like Ethiopia and Nigeria and places like that in order to help the pharaohs build these monuments to mankind. These monuments have lasted for thousands of years. So a king decides to build this big pyramid, and then of course the next king would build a bigger pyramid, and the king after that would build a bigger pyramid, and keep going on and on. But you can go to Giza now, and somewhere among all those McDonald's and all those other tourist attractions, there are these humongous pyramids that are a monument to ancient Egyptian kings, and they still stand to this day. And our narrator helped raise those pyramids on the banks of the Nile. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen his muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. Now, there could be a double entendre in that singing of the Mississippi. It could be referring to slaves singing as they do their labor in the fields. In fact, a lot of times slaves would use music as a way to time themselves, or maybe as a way to ease their misery or to make the time pass as they were out in the fields doing the labor, doing the hard labor. Alright, so the singing of the Mississippi could be that, but also the river itself and its flow. Remember also that the Mississippi was extremely important for the slave trade. Slaves were hauled up and down the river and sold to the plantation owners, and then those slaves would work alongside the river on these big plantations. So, of course, Lincoln, as we all know, Lincoln actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation and fought a civil war in order not only to keep the states together but also to abolish slavery. So our narrator's soul was there for Lincoln, for the slave trade, and for the Mississippi River, whose muddy bosom turns all golden in the sunset. If you've never seen the Mississippi River, there are places where it looks pretty muddy, and it's actually not the prettiest river in the world. But as the sun sets just right, and that glow almost makes the river itself glow, that can be a beautiful sight. And it only lasts for a few minutes during sunset, but it can take that muddy bosom and turn it into some golden, beautiful river. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So, it's fitting that if civilization sprung up around rivers, monuments were built on rivers, slave trade was done on rivers, actually trade of anything, cattle, livestock, agricultural goods, manufactured goods, anything can be traded on the rivers, on these huge barges and such, then it makes sense that the soul of humankind or of a certain race might also grow deep over time. There's a wisdom in that. There's also a comfort in knowledge in that. So, Negro Speaks of Rivers is really a tribute to an entire race, spoken by that entire race as kind of a collective narrator. So that's Negro Speaks of Rivers. So I hope this slideshow and this presentation. Let me see. Let me try one thing real quickly. Written by Hughes, who's the narrator. Souls grown deep, 4 important rivers. Okay. And then the slaves working by the rivers. So I hope that you found this video presentation and the slideshow useful to help you in the understanding of Langston Hughes and the poetry that he wrote. Again, feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your papers.